With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Heard Tell Show. It's Andrew Donaldson. It is a Monday, August the 29th, year of our Lord 2022. First day of school around these parts, wherever you are across the street or around the world. We hope you're well. Hope you had a great weekend. Hope you're ready for another great week of giving us 1 hour a day, every weekday, turning down the noise of the news cycle. Hour a day keeps the caterwauling away. That's what we try to do real hard here, bring you stories that matter. Today on the program, we're going to talk a little bit about ifs and buts, because we're already starting a lot of ifs and buts of what's going to happen in the midterm, and by extension, what might happen in the 2024 election. And as my old chief used to tell me, more than two ifs isn't a plan, it's a prayer. We'll get into that in just a little bit. Also, to end the program, we always do something uplifting. This guy's very uplifting. He's actually climbing a mountain after a brain injury, something I know a little bit about. It's not fun recovering over it. And this guy doing adventure sports like Tough Mudder races, 10Ks, and charity raising to go climb high mountains, more power to him. We'll bring you that great story to end the program. Great guest on the program today. We're going to go overseas. We've talked a lot on this program about Sri Lanka. I think we're talking about it more than just about any program of our kind that I've seen anywhere, because it's an important topic. That country has collapsed. It's a failed state at this point. A lot of crossroads of geopolitics. But what started a lot of this was their agricultural policy, what they call organic farming. And this isn't organic farming like the label you see at the grocery store, where you try to get things that are nice and clean and more natural and less pesticides. I get all that. That's all a fine thing. Over there, though, they started pushing organic farming, and it was pushed by people outside the country, and it devastated the crops, and it almost completely decimated the farming industry. Torben Halbe from over in Germany is going to join us, Young Voices contributor. Great in-depth conversation. He is a biologist by trade. He's going to get into the nitty-gritty of this. What happens when you don't let a country use pesticides? What happens when you don't let a country use modern farming technology to harvest crops? The yield goes way down, and in a country like Sri Lanka, where you've got poverty and a lot of economic developmental issues, people starve quick. It has a body count to it. This isn't theory. This is something that's killing people. Torben Halbe on the program today. We're going to go real in-depth on Sri Lanka that started this, and then the political powers that be like China and others who came in, swept in, and made it even worse. We've been going to talk about Sri Lanka. We're going to talk about it a little bit more today, because it's something you better learn, because it's coming to other parts of the world very soon. But first, I want to talk about the midterm elections for just a second. We've got a couple different guests this week. We're going to talk about the midterm elections. We're going to talk about what the Democratic Party has, and this is pretty good branding. They came up with a good one here. They've called it the 5 to flip, the 5 Senate races they think they can win to take back the Senate. Now, one of those is in Ohio. Now, Ohio has trended redder and redder. Donald Trump won it handily both of his elections. Not running away with it, but it is a red state. I don't think we can really call it a swing state anymore. But Tim Ryan, longtime congressman there, is running for the Senate seat there. And he was probably not a favorite to win this race. But there's been a couple things develop. One is the GOP prospects across the board have kind of waned a little bit. But number two is J.D. Vance is his opponent. Now, I'm not just saying this because full bias is on the table. I can't stand J.D. Vance. I hate his stupid book. He's a duplicitous hypocrite, and I can't stand the man personally, professionally, or his political brand in any way, shape, or form. Now that I laid my biases on the table, I can still tell you whether or not he's a good candidate. So this isn't me not liking J.D. Vance telling you this. I have sourced this with multiple people over the last few weeks who know what they are doing. Multiple people have reached out to him from the right to try to help his campaign. It's flagging. They don't know what they're doing, and they are making a hash of it. And I've talked to multiple people who are like, yeah, we've tried to help him, and they told us to saw it off and weren't real nice about it. So now Mitch McConnell and his political action committee is steering tens of millions of dollars into Ohio to try to bail out J.D. Vance in a seat that should have been a layup, especially in the current environment. But it's not. Now, that's one part of this story. The other part of this story is Tim Ryan is running a very moderately paced campaign. He's talking to normal people about normal things. He's playing down his Democratic record and some of the things that are more to the left, and he's trying to run the only race he can run if he actually hopes to win. Now, this has upset some of our progressive friends. I want to give you something off of Twitter here because it is instructional to something that we've seen elsewhere. We've seen it with Joe Biden. You're going to see it with Kristen Sinema when she comes up and gets primaried from the left. Some of our progressive friends on the left cannot stand it when some folks in their own party are a little bit more moderate. So Tim Ryan was on Dana Bash. Now, as you know, I do not watch the Sunday programs. I have sworn off them. It's a personal health decision that has worked out really, really well to me. Go to church, go to the farmer's market. I do all kinds of fun things on Sunday morning, watch a little Premier League, get ready for NFL now that it's going to be starting in a few weeks. I don't watch the Sunday shows purposefully. It's just a remix of whatever happened. Nothing important happens. But I grabbed this off Twitter because Tim Ryan was on with Dana Bash, and he criticized Joe Biden's forgiveness of student loan debt. Now, we've talked about this on the program already. We'll talk about that some other time. You can have your opinion on that. He's came out against it because he's in a tight Senate race. And this is not playing well in Ohio because he's not a dumb man. They've got the polling. They've decided to go against it. So now, if you go in the replies to this, and I'll link to this, over and over again, it's like, I don't know if I can vote for Tim Ryan. He may be another Joe Manchin, or he may be another Kristen Sinema. Can we have some grown folk talk? Please sit down and listen to me for just a second. I'm going to explain politics in America to you real fast. If you do not have Joe Manchin in the Democratic Party, who is the only Democrat that could win a statewide race in the state of West Virginia, you do not have Democratic control of the U.S. Senate right now. Does everybody got that, or do we need to write it down on a graphic? You can hate Joe Manchin all you want to. You can call him whatever names you want to. You can hate his policy. But if you are a Democrat or a progressive, if he is not there and he is not who he is, you do not have the U.S. Senate right now. You do not have any of the accomplishments that Joe Biden has pushed through that Senate in the last 2 years. None of that happens without Joe Manchin winning a race that no other Democrat would have a prayer of even getting close to. You've ran a progressive the last 2 cycles, one against Joe Manchin himself and the other against the other senator in West Virginia, and that progressive person lost by over 40 points both times. Get over yourself. You either want a majority or you don't. Now, that's not my tribe and it's not my party. Y'all can do what you want. I'm just going to give you some free advice because this is going to come up over and over again in states that are purple, in swing states, in states that are swinging in which ways they go. And you're going to do it as we talked with our friend Eric Garcia on the Heard Tell podcast this weekend. Make sure you go listen to it. We go in depth on this. They're going to do this with Kristen Sinema. If you've got a purple state and you run a hardcore progressive, you're probably going to lose, and you may lose to somebody you really don't want to lose to, especially in a state like Arizona, where the GOP are putting up some, frankly, unfit for office people. Do you want to win or do you not want to win? Do you want a majority or do you not want a majority? Because this kind of nonsense, this kind of purity test, you're not going to get a majority. Now, the Democrats have a good look with their 5 to flip. That's good branding. And they're right. They're going to have a good chance to get those 5 seats. It's going to depend on a couple of things. And one of it is they need all of their own Democratic base to come out and rally behind these candidates. And if you start doing nonsense like that, my progressive friends, you may shoot yourself in the foot and you might end up with the Republican Party back in charge of the U.S. Senate. So I know it's fun to say things on Twitter, but maybe you should plan ahead more than one cycle. And our Republican friends are very guilty of this as well. You might want to plan ahead a little bit, because you're not going to like where it ends up if you've only got people like you. Because that crowd that's just like you is way too small to do things that matter, like have a majority in the U.S. Senate. Check yourself, listen, pay attention to what's really going on before you start raking people over the coals for not being ideologically pure. You either win or you don't. And that kind of attitude, you won't. More Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, let's go back overseas. Going to Germany, country I love dearly. Got to live there 2 different times, close to my heart. And a new contributor from Young Voices. Very excited to talk to him. Torben Halbe. Halbe. See, I messed it up, and I was even practicing it despite my German. My Sprechen Sie Deutsch is not what it should be, my friend. But I'm glad to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. You were writing about Sri Lanka. Before we get into the details for it, because we've been covering it for our audience because it crosses a whole lot of streams with geopolitics, economic things, foreign policy stuff. What got you into looking into Sri Lanka? Because I know while we've been covering it, what got you interested in it that you started digging into it yourself?
Well, to be honest, I never had much interest in Sri Lanka, except for, well, I am generally following politics around the world, but I had no special interest in Sri Lanka. But I am a biologist, you know. Of course, I followed the news about the current crisis in Sri Lanka, and then I heard that organic farming was related to it, because there was a ban on organic farming in April of 2021, which contributed to the whole crisis. As a politically interested biologist, I like to criticize organic farming, not as a luxury, but I criticize the idea that it would be able to feed mankind, basically. And I admire science, and I admire the progress that has been made in food production, if you consider artificial fertilizers and pesticides. And I think those are, well, some of the best inventions in the history of mankind. And then you have these people, these organic farming universalists, so to speak, who just want to get rid of that for ideological reasons. And that really bothers me.
Now, you say you're a biologist. People are going to like, well, what's that got to do with politics? Well, it has quite a bit to do with it, but let's get the nomenclature right, because when you see organic, people think organic like the label they see at the supermarket, something is organic. Organic farming in and of itself isn't new, because farmers have always, they raise their livestock, then they use the manure for the livestock to fertilize their field. That kind of organic stuff has been going on for centuries. That's all healthy stuff. When you're talking organic farming in a bad sense when it comes to things like Sri Lanka, though, this is a new use of the word organic, isn't it? Where they're trying to just strip away any kind of advancements in technology. Just walk us through the nomenclature as a biologist for a minute, what you mean by this kind of organic.
Yes, you're right. Traditional farming was organic. People had no choice, basically. They would farm very ineffectively, backbreaking labor, without machines, without artificial fertilizer. Well, this kind of gradually started to change. For example, people started to use guano. I don't know how it's pronounced in English. It's like bird shit, basically. Yeah. And it was like a very effective fertilizer. For example, during the colonial age that it was discovered, and for most of the industrial age, it was used to fertilize fields. There were even wars about some islands which contain a lot of that. But then there was a German chemist, Fritz Haber, developed an amazing method to get nitrogen out of the air. As you know, nitrogen is the main constituent of air, but it's molecular nitrogen, N2, which is not very reactive. And then he figured out a method to combine it with hydrogen to produce ammonium in the end, which you can use to fertilize. And this changed everything. And, well, it helped to even sustain the population in the world that we have today. And, of course, the other important development were pesticides. Before pesticides, you would have farmers used to do it by hand, but eventually you would have machines to do it. Pesticides kind of do away with that need to put that much labor into getting rid of all those harmful other plants which would compete with your food plants.
Yeah, and basically what they did was, when you can fertilize and you cut down on pesticides, which cuts down, you're increasing the yield exponentially. People can grow a lot more crops, and they can do it more sustainably, and they can get more. They're going to know what they're going to get out of each crop, that sort of thing. So fast forward to Sri Lanka. The government in Sri Lanka in 2021 starts cracking down on organic farming. Now, this is a country that's already impoverished to start with. But when they started to crack down on this organic farming, and again, not natural farming or cyclical farming, we call it in English. I don't know what they call it in Europe, but I can smell the smell right now driving through the German countryside. They still organically fertilize in a lot of places. In Sri Lanka, the government started intervening and pushing for this new organic farming, they called it, where they didn't want the fertilizer and they didn't want the pesticide. What happened in Sri Lanka that started a lot of the tragedy that we're seeing now?
Well, in Sri Lanka, they decided to do basically an overnight ban for the import of inorganic fertilizer as well as synthetic pesticides like glyphosate. So it was just banned, so people couldn't import it anymore. And for their farming, they had relied on that. This just destroyed farming, and it had an effect on rice farming, which is like the main food they grow there, but it also had an effect on tea farming, which they normally export, and which really contributes to the trade balance of Sri Lanka, because it's an important and expensive good that they export. So they, at the same time, reduce their ability to export, which plunged a lot of people into poverty. And they also were not able to grow enough food for their own population anymore, which they then had to try and import. And you have to remember that at that time, they already were in a currency crisis. So the currency was already weak. They already had few foreign reserve in currency. So, and now all of a sudden their exports died down and they had to import a lot of food, which really added to the crisis overall. So not only people had a food shortage and couldn't really farm anymore, but it really spiraled out of control into other areas of the economy because of the whole foreign exchange problem.
Because Sri Lanka, as we've been covering, they are down to almost no foreign currency reserves. This is an island nation, so when you have to start importing and exporting, that's more fuel, that's more effort. The food shortage problem, of course, raises prices on everything else. The fuel shortage means you can't make food. When you can't produce your own food in a country, especially an isolated country, an island country that's already impoverished, that's a domino that is just basically the worst possible thing to have happen to an economy, especially one that was already under stress, as you pointed out.
Exactly. And before that ban, they could produce all the foods they needed, at least when it comes to rice. Of course, they would have imported other foods to some degree, but rice, which was the main food for them, they were self-sufficient on that, as long as they still had fertilizer, as long as they still had real pesticides. And ironically, the whole scheme of just banning the import of these things was supposed to save the currency, and it was supposed to save the the foreign reserves, the foreign currency reserves, because someone looked at the balance and saw that each year they import a lot of fertilizer and they import a lot of pesticides, and then they thought, let's just ban it. So we no longer have to import all that stuff, and we will no longer have to pay for it and lose our remaining foreign currency. But of course, that's not how it works, because in the end, it costs them much more. They were no longer importing it, but then they couldn't grow enough food and they couldn't grow enough tea to export. So it was a bad decision for the balance overall.
Yeah, Torben Halbe joining us. And the thing about this is we know that the current government, well, the now ex-government, because they've had to flee, the government in Sri Lanka had a lot of issues. They had some nepotism, they had incompetence, they had corruption. But the international community, there was a lot of cheerleading for this rule when it first came into place, wasn't it?
Yes. if we talk about organic farming, and I don't mean organic farming in the sense that some wealthy people just buy it as a luxury. This is just a market, I would say. I'm not talking about organic farming as a universal idea where people want to turn all farming organic. And there are some scholars and activists around the world, many in the West, but also in other countries, who, they think it would be a really good idea to just scrap conventional farming entirely. And that lobbying for this in different ways. In the West, politics is quite complex, and a lot of interest groups have some interaction. So you couldn't just ban organic farming overnight. What you will have in the West is two things. You will either these activists and scholars will either try to go for limits, which means, for example, you have a limit on nitrate, which you can emit into the environment as a farmer. And since mineral fertilizer will contain nitrate, you will easily go over that limit. So this is kind of like an indirect pressure against conventional farming. And this is the cause of the current Dutch farmers' protests in the EU, because the EU has these limits. Dutch farming is very intensive. Even though it's like quite a small country, they are feeding a lot of Europe, basically, because they have very efficient, intensive farming. And all those other European countries, it's kind of the problem if you have a union of a lot of countries and they are very different. For all those countries who do not have that intensive farming, it's easy to agree to some limits on nitrate because, for them, it just looks good in the media and they will never reach those limits anyway. But, the Dutch do reach those limits, So that's one thing in developed countries. And the other thing would be to define like a percentage-based area for organic farming, which has also happened in the EU. There's a EU strategy to turn 20% of the entire farmland in the EU to organic farming in the next few years. So again, this is not considering the market. It's just like a political directive, which people, because of some lobbyists, have implemented. But in the West, you will still have farmers associations and other lobbies who work against this. So you will not get 100%, which is good. 20% enforced, 20% is bad, but it's still better than 100%. While in developing countries, if you are such a lobbyist and you somehow manage to influence, for example, in Sri Lanka, the ruling family, so to speak, you can go for crazy things like 100% overnight.
And that was what really happened in Sri Lanka was, even if you were going to do this, farmers plan way ahead of time. They're planning 2 or 3 seasons ahead of time. They're, right now we're into the fall. They've already planned for the winter. They're already working on spring and next year's, but because they're always working ahead. Your background is in biology. What kind of an effect to the practical farming is it when you just get a rule out of the clear blue sky that is immediately implemented like this? It's the worst case scenario, and it's absolutely impossible for the farmers because they've already got their crops in for not only this season, but probably next season. They're stored up for the winter, whatever the seasons are down there. This is a devastating thing to just spring on an industry like farming without any warning whatsoever, isn't it?
Yes, of course, especially if you consider that Sri Lanka is a quite poor country. What happened in Sri Lanka was that large parts of the farmlands went unused even because farmers didn't know how to deal with it. Nearly a third of agricultural land remained unused in 2021, and rice production fell by 20%. Yeah, that's what happens.
Yeah, I don't think even the Soviets were able to do that fast back in the day. Torben Halbe joining us. I'm going to keep working on his name. I'm going to get it right, I promise. He's got another example in the piece from neighboring to Sri Lanka over in India. We're going to talk about that real quick. Continue to talk about the organic mission, kind of where the politics and the practical aren't matching up. Our friend Torben Halbe over in Germany will continue on Herd Tell right after this. Welcome back to Hort. See, I was practicing my German. Now I can't even say the name of my own show in English, but as our friend just pointed out, the language of the world is bad English, so we're all good here. I'm Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell. That's Torben Halbe. That's our good friend from Germany joining us. We're having a little bit of a language problem, but we're going to get through it because he's a very sharp individual. We're talking about Sri Lanka, but you compared next door to Sri Lanka, of course, is India. India is one of the world powers. One of the reasons we have been paying attention to Sri Lanka is because China's involved, India's involved. America holds a bond on a lot of the debt. This is a lot of geopolitics. But you took one of the farming examples from neighboring India. Tell us about that and how it also proves that this organic mission of farming, this new definition of organic farming, this is probably going to fail just about everywhere they try it if they insist on doing this top-down kind of instant change thing instead of letting it, for lack of a better term, organically develop and the technology involved, right?
Well, I would say even if you give it time, you will never reach 100% of organic farming. You will probably not even reach the 20% that the European Union is trying to go for, because it's not efficient. The idea that, as I said, a lot of experts and activists were lobbying Sri Lanka for this decision. One example is actually a guy from Washington. His name is Hans Rudolf Herren. Hans Rudolf Herren of Washington-based Millennium Institute was one of these experts, and another was Vandana Shiva from India. So it's not all Western experts, but still quite a lot. They were first lobbying Sri Lanka to go for this change overnight, and when that succeeded, the international community of these activists applauded Sri Lanka for the decision. Of course, it didn't go well. So the reaction was to say, the reaction of this pro-organic farming community was to say, well, it was just too sudden, The farmers didn't have time to adapt, even though, it was some of them who actually advised the government to go for this sudden change, however. So the farmers didn't have time to adapt. And if you go for it more slowly, then it will work out. And you can just slowly but surely turn all farming organic. But you mentioned India, and there is a state in India which is called Sikkim. And in that state, they actually try to go for universal organic farming, but in a slow and controlled way. And it still turned out bad. What happened in Sikkim was, so they began the organic mission, as they called it, in 2003. And then only 13 years later, in 2016, they declared it to be fully organic. And this was a law. So all farmers were strictly forbidden to use synthetic pesticides and chemical fertilizers. It didn't turn out well, even though there had been many years to adapt, because, in the same year, 2016, some researchers declared Sikkim food deficient. They said that organic farming, can only provide 30% of the population's needs. And the other 70% of food had to be imported. So they started to import a non-organic food from neighboring Indian states, which is a pattern which we will continue to see. For example, the same thing happened in Bhutan, which is another state in the region which also tried to go for 100% organic farming. As soon as you go for that, you will not have enough food. The food price will rise, and if you don't want people to starve, especially in a developing country, you will have to import non-organic food. So in the end, you're just, sabotaging your own non-organic farming just to import non-organic food from other countries, which makes no sense actually. Yeah, and eventually the government in Sikkim saw it as a problem that their organic transition doesn't work. And their idea was to try and ban the import of non-organic food. But luckily, this led to protests. People, not only farmers, I think also the retailers protested because they knew that people wouldn't have been able to pay 6 times the price for the food. Not even middle-class customers could have done that. So they protested, and in the end, the government of Sikkim didn't ban the import of other food, of non-organic food. this protest prevented starvation and rioting, because in Sri Lanka we actually see rioting and we actually see the food shortage.
Why is there such a disconnect? Because farming is not like some esoteric debate club topic. You're either producing food or you're not. This is a hard and fast kind of business of like, you produce the food or you don't. You produce the animals, you don't. You produce the crops or you don't. And if you don't produce food, people are going to suffer. And yet there's still folks and activists that just, despite this evidence in front of them, will continue to push this, no matter what, we need to do this right now because of reasons. And they'll say environmental reasons or political reasons or whatever the case may be. I don't understand how you can see human suffering and not go, okay, we need to adjust here. And yet we're seeing it, like you just said, we saw it in India. We're seeing it in Sri Lanka. We're going to see it again and again. Why is there that disconnect between what's happening in reality and the activist, intellectual, political, the folks that sit in places like Brussels that don't put their hands in the dirt? They just can't seem to put the two and two together, or do they just don't care?
Well, that's a classic problem of intellectualism, I would say. You have intellectuals in all areas who don't work. It's not just farming, you have people whose only job is to criticize those who do work. And if you then succeed in your criticism and some measures get taken, some political measures, the only thing you can do is keep criticizing, because it's your job, So you kind of have to keep criticizing until all the limits for nitrate and all the other stuff is so problematic, so impossible to keep, that entire systems collapse. So this class of intellectuals is a huge problem. Another problem is, at least in Western systems, as I said, you still have farmers associations who kind of work against that, which is good. But in politics, this is all about compromise. If you have one side who asks for some limits on nitrate, for example, and you have the other side who says, oh, let's have no limit, the normal political process will result in some compromise, which is in the middle. So you have some sort of limit. And then a few years later, there will be the same discussion again. So the activists will ask for higher limits, and then the farmers will say, oh, no, let's keep the current limits. And then, another compromise, This is a problem with politics, that it's not about who knows what's best, because that would be the market. In the market, if farmers were just in the market, they would know for what cost they can produce, how much food, and where to sell it, and the customers would know how much they want to pay. But in politics, it's not about that. In politics, it's about, who has a lobby, who has power, and then you work on some sort of compromise between these people.
What should we gather, though? Because like you said, the richer countries or richer individuals that want to do organic farming, they're more than capable of going out, buying some farmland and doing this to their heart's content. What should we take away? The fact that European countries and other countries, they seem to converge on a place like Sri Lanka that's already got problems and that are susceptible, and let's just call it what it is. They're kind of being victimized here with this. They're getting guinea pigged on stuff like this. Just on a moral level, I find that to be very wrong, but also on a policy, if you really want to advocate for your thing, why would you try it in somewhere that's probably doomed to fail anyway because of the circumstances? This really feels like they took advantage of Sri Lanka on multiple levels here, to me. Does it to you?
Yes, to me it feels like a sort of colonialism. I dislike the word because so many leftists use it, for all sorts of things. but in that case, it really is like that. You have wealthy, powerful people in the West, but in the West, they're making slow progress. Progress from their point of view, because in the West, politics is more complex, more integrated, and other people also have a say. So instead, they go to places where it's easier to influence politics. To a degree, they really believe in it. Of course, there's money in that. There's money in that too. If you, for example, produce organic fertilizer or something like that, then of course, if you can influence political decisions so that you will sell more of it, you will make money. But that's not all of it. I think they're really just convinced that this would be good for the world, and they make a living from telling people that would be good for the world. So that they have to keep going, they have to keep it running.
What's what's a practical thing we can talk to? Put your biology hat on for just a second. What's something practical here? Because really the problem with this is when you come in with a top-down regulatory thing like this organic farming, what we really need to do if we're worried about feeding people, which should be the first concern with farming, is how to unleash them, not how to entangle them in something that's not going to work. Is it a policy answer? Is it a public pressure answer? Is it highlighting this failure and dealing with it in a human way? What's the path forward here to try to get some traction on this issue in a productive way, do you think?
It's a good question. I mean, in the big picture, I think we as somewhat classical liberal people, we are always arguing against all the intellectuals and all those areas. But that's probably too big of a thing to address, and it will take many years, I guess, to go to the bottom of that problem, and it will not help. It will not help with the current debate. So, well, the science is quite clear. The science is clear. Plants will need nutrients, and if you don't get those nutrients to them in an efficient way, they will not grow as efficiently. Same for pesticides. If your plants are always beset by some sort of I don't know, insect or whatever, that will take away from the total nutrition this plant can provide, and it might even kill the plant. You can also look at history. You can see how in the past, from the same field, people were able to get far less food than they can now. And if you look at European history, you will see a lot of episodes where there was starvation because the harvest failed, and these are things that we no longer have because of fertilizer and because of pesticides, because of progress, technological progress. This is one argument that I would make, but to some degree, the whole culture of arguing is intellectual in itself. You know what I mean? It's always about, well, this notion that you could come up with some solution to very complex problems, that you could come up with some solutions in some sort of abstract level where some smart people discuss. While I think in truth, the solution is with the people on the ground, the people who do the farming, who have the practical experience. But they are not intellectuals. They will not join any discussions in any proper way. And even if they would, it's not some sort of information that you could put into words. The knowledge where to plant what and how to fertilize your field and all of that. It's not good for intellectual debate. So what I would try to argue is to just leave it to the people who know how to do it. That's what I would at least try to do, even though I think with the current culture of debate, it will be difficult.
Leave it to the people that know what they're doing is such a simple concept, and yet we develop entire political ideologies to make sure we don't do that very thing. Isn't that amazing? Humans are an amazing species because that's exactly what we do. Our friend Torben Halbe from over in Germany has been joining us. Fantastic conversation. We really appreciate your time today. Again, the suffering in Sri Lanka is horrible. Please make sure you keep up to date with what's going on with those folks. My friend, until we hear from you again, let folks know what you have going on, where they can follow you. We're going to link to your piece in Town Hall. Please read the whole thing in its entirety. We always tell folks, but let folks know where they can follow you and what you have going on until we talk to you again.
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter. Yes, it's just Torben Halbe. Now that it has been said so often, you can actually go for that. So my name is just Torben Halbe, without any spaces or anything. And I recently joined a think tank in Berlin, which is called Ego Institute. We want to go for the individualism. So it's quite new still, but the address is ego/institute.org. As of now, it's all still in German, but you can follow us there, sign up for the newspaper, and we are in the progress of translating it. It's just still a very young thing.
Yep, and we can always Google Translate until then. Torben, my friend, very much appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to talking to you again in the future. Best of luck with the new think tank, and we'll speak again real soon, my friend. Thank you for your time.
Same. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you, sir. Welcome back to Heard Tell. I'm Andrew Donaldson. You ever heard tell that old sing-songy rhyme? It actually comes from England, but Don Meredith, the Cowboys quarterback, kind of made it famous in America of, if it's and buts for candies and nuts, oh, what a great Christmas we'd have, and there's other variations of it. Well, that seems to be the version that Victor David Hanson's working off of and writing a piece. I'm not going to read the whole piece. It's in American Greatness. It's a long list of the usual stuff when it comes to Donald Trump and the forthcoming election, but his last paragraph caught my attention, and I wanted to draw brief attention to it. He said, "Yet, if the Republicans advance a coherent national plan of action to restore a pre-Biden America, if Donald Trump will focus positively on national issues and not take the bait to obsess on the wrongs done to him, and if grassroots conservatives this time around prepare to preemptive massive left-wing vote harassing, they will achieve their blowout, meaning the midterms. But that's a lot of ifs. And meanwhile, time grows short." Now, read his whole piece. Decide for yourself. I found it to be a long list of things that he says are so that are not so, but you can make up your own mind on that. But here's my rule of thumb. A supervisor I had years and years ago in the military told me anything more than two ifs is not a plan, that's a prayer, and it's not going to work out well for you. And this is a whole lot of ifs. The Republicans do not have a national plan of actions that's coherent because they can't, because they don't know the status of Donald Trump for the 2024 election yet. And the midterm election is mostly about Biden's poor approval numbers. Problem is, those are coming up. And if the economy gets a little bit better, they don't really have a coherent message other than anti-Biden, and that may not be enough. Now, I still think they get the House. The Senate's looking pretty sketchy, but we'll talk about that some other time. His second point is even more ludicrous. Donald Trump will focus positively on national issues and not take the bait on obsessing wrongs done with him. I'm not sure. Victor David Hanson is a very smart man. His history books are fantastic. This is nonsense. You've seen what he's been doing for the last 6 years. You saw what he did in the Georgia recall. You've seen what he's doing in these midterms. He's going to do the same thing in 2024. We know who Donald Trump is. He's not going to change. He's completely obsessed over the wrongs done for him because he's completely about him. That's not going to change, and you can wish it and if it and but it all you want to. The reality is very much the same. So if our Republican friends are going to insist on ifs and buts getting them to their Merry Christmas, they're going to be in for a disappointment, because ifs and buts are not a plan. It's definitely not an electoral plan. And the voters are coming in November, and they're going to judge you accordingly. And by the way, even if you get the House in 2 years, you better have some accomplishments, because now you're in charge. People will judge you accordingly. And all the ifs and buts in the world aren't going to stave off a list of not having any accomplishments. More Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. We always try to end on an uplifting note. This one's from overseas. Let's go to Euronews.com. Climbing a 4,000-meter mountain is no easy feat, but for intrepid adventurer Matt Carpenter, it's more than just a challenge. It's a chance to prove that brain injury can't stop him and raise money for charity that helped save his life. In September, the Data 2 is trekking North Africa's highest peak, Mount Toubkal, in Morocco. It may be Toubkal. I don't know. I'm probably mispronouncing this. Very sorry if I mispronounce it. To double your money back for this episode. Hikers summit the most majestic peak in the rugged Atlas mountain range, ascending to 4,167 meters above sea level. I can't do the math, but that's real high, even in proper measurements and not the metric system. Quote, "It's easily to show how people on the same journey as mine, that mountain-sized challenges are achievable," Matt said. Matt is fundraising for PAUL, PAUL, that's an acronym for Brain Recovery, a British charity providing support, guidance, and education to people impacted by acquiring brain injury. Alongside the trek, he is also running his first ever half marathon. On top of that, being the overachiever that he is, for every 10 pounds raised, he will take a custard pie to the face. Boy, that's suffering. I like that idea. "It feels brilliant to be giving back," he says, but it's been a long run to Mount Toubkal. In 2010, Matt was admitted to the hospital for suffering a concussion, but a routine CT scan delivered an all clear. For 8 years, the Hall local lived a normal, busy life. He regularly fundraised for charity, worked a job at a homeless shelter, and fathered kids. In 2018, he was struck by a sudden seizure after doctors ordered another CT scan. They discovered a tumor. The malignant lump is visible on his 2010 scan, but the doctors missed it. By the time it was discovered, it had grown to the size of a Cadbury cream egg. It knocked him for 6. He'd been there all the time. I thought been a thing in my brain getting bigger and bigger, and it was causing problems. So after emergency neurosurgery, Matt sprung back into fundraising. He advised his doctors. He completed a brutal Tough Mudder obstacle race. Those things are brutal. That's well done. And a 10K charity race. In hindsight, he admits he was in denial about his medical prognosis, but the tumor returned. He was forced to accept he needed help. Despite undertaking grueling courses of chemotherapy and radiotherapy, Matt still managed to complete the Yorkshire Three-Peak Challenge and bagged Scaffold Pike, English highest mountain. The relentless hospitalizations battered his mental health, but the chemo seemed to work. So far, it seems like the little sucker is gone, but there's probably traces of it somewhere in my brain. He's always loved traveling. He's done animal work, and he's fundraising to do this Mount Tuck Bowl. I'm going to pronounce that multiple ways until I get it right. It is mostly about raising money for charity, but personally cathartic. This is my time. The idea is to get around and shout, F you brain tumor. He laughs. That'll feel pretty good. More power to him. I hope he does. Somebody who's had to recover from a TBI before, I wish you well. Well done, my friend. If you want to donate to him, it'll be in the show notes. We'll have links to his page. That'll do it for this Monday edition of Heard Tell. Thank you so much for being with us. Got an exciting week of guests lined up. No shortage of news stories that need turned down. You can reach out, though. You got a question, comment, something you want us to cover? We've done whole shows just based on your feedback and things you wanted to talk about at HeardTellShow on gmail.com. If you want to email us, at HeardTellShow on the Twitter, you can DM us or send an open question there. Of course, my Twitter handle, 4footfire, is on the screen, as is our guest. Make sure you're following them. So until we do this again tomorrow, we will be back for more Heard Tell. Make sure you check out the Heard Tell podcast. Eric Garcia's on it again, inside and on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Great stuff. Don't miss it. Wherever you and yours are, we hope you're well. We hope you're well fed. We will talk to you again next time for more Heard Tell.
All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.